Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and at this time of year, most of us in the northern states are getting ready to start planting. I know lots of you in the southern states, your gardens are well underway, and spring is definitely there already. You guys are very much inspiring us who are just coming out of winter. So it's the last 4 weeks for me here in Maine before gardening season is on. So I'm dusting off my overalls and we're going to take a little bit of a break from integrated pest management to run through some jobs on the homestead and garden. Now, this weekend has seen a lot of Earth Day activities going on in many communities across America. There's been things about repurposing or planting seeds, starting a garden, even taking a walk in the woods on a hiking trail. There's been lots and lots of activities, guided nature walks, foraging, all the way through to, straight up seed swaps. For me, I was at a seedling swap, and I've also been using various containers to use as seed starting containers. Things like juice cartons, or those boxes that had stock or broth in them, making newspaper seedling pots, right? There's lots of things that you can do to help cut the costs of gardening. Basically, if it'll hold soil or a liquid, it's basically getting seeds put in it at my house anyway. So I'm sorry, honey, but the dining table is going to be unavailable for a few more weeks, because right now, with it being about 4 weeks to go before the average last frost date, at least on my homestead, it is time to start my squashes, corn, melons, cucumbers, sorghum, quinoa, basil, bok choy, lettuce. And of course, my sweet peas, which are one of my absolute favourite flowers. My grandmother grew sweet peas, so I always get reminded of her garden when I grow them. So I am making a definite effort this year to grow more of them, because sweet peas were one of those things that didn't grow very well for me in Utah. I think it was the heat and the climate that they struggled with. So I'm hoping here in New England they're going to be growing a lot better. So there's a lot to get started when it comes to seeds this month, but also things like your tomatoes, peppers, or if you've got eggplant growing, those crops that have a long season and take a long time to mature, those things are going to need transplanting into bigger containers. You want to be giving your seeds or seedlings, more room to grow, especially whilst you're waiting for the risk of frost to pass. It's also a really good time to feed your seedlings too whilst you're transplanting them. And even as you're going and checking your plants, making sure they've got adequate water, and, remembering to feed your seedlings, because that's something I often forget. And when you kind of go to a seed swap and things, you can often see where you've got plants that have, been fed versus those that have not. And by feeding them, I'm not meaning, picking up, some chemical feeds or anything like that, chemical fertilizers and things. You can get ones that are unlisted, those that are suitable for organic farming and organic gardening. And, it doesn't hurt to give those plants a little bit of a boost. But also, as you're transplanting, it's a good opportunity to add a little bit of compost to your mix as you're putting them into a larger container. And it's good for your plants, especially things like peppers and tomatoes. Tomatoes you can plant deeper into the container, so they're going to have more roots. And, when you're going to plant them outside anyway, you want to be planting tomatoes deeper into the soil, so they're going to be able to grow a lot more roots. They're going to be able to get deeper, they're going to be able to get to the nutrients, and they're going to have sturdier plants in doing so. So that's kind of what's going on with the seedling front. But let's talk about out in the garden, because it's time to prepare your garden beds if you haven't already. So you want to be clearing away any old plants from last year, hoeing any weeds, or pulling them out by hand, because weeds are nature's, way of protecting the soil, right? Weeds come up to cover that soil and stop it from being exposed to the wind and the rain and the other things that winter throws at our garden soil. So weeds often come up very early in the garden. They're opportunistic. So the earlier that we can get things planted in our gardens, or at least cover our garden beds with mulch, that's going to help reduce some of the weeds that come up from time to time. So we want to be clearing out any old plants that we've got, hoeing those weeds, pull them out by hand if that's what you're into. I know that there's some really troublesome weeds, right? Bindweed, crabgrass, mugwort are some that come to mind, right? And a lot of these weeds propagate by spreading either seeds. So remember the saying, if you listen to the podcast quite a lot, 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding, right? Because plants generate a lot of seeds. They like to propagate, and weeds are no exception. But for things like bindweed, crabgrass, and mugwort, they also propagate from little bits of the root that are left in the soil, and they just kind of grow from there. So it is a battle, right? I've had to deal with bindweed in many a garden that I have had. One in the UK, one's here in the US, my allotment. Like, bindweed has just kind of followed me around wherever I've seen to had to grow a garden. And, my homestead is no exception. There's lots of different things in there. And now I have some other fun weeds that are very similar that I have to now contend with. So there's a few things that I do when I'm weeding these troublesome weeds. So I try and dig out and pull out as many of the roots as possible. I don't put those into the compost. I will put them somewhere else, like the general trash, or I will, drown them in a bucket of water for a few weeks, turn them into a liquid fertilizer that I can then use later, or some people even burn those weeds if burning is allowed where you live. Now, so I'm pulling out as much of these roots and stuff as possible. I then transplant a seedling into the area. So if you've got a bigger transplant, that can go out, like, that's why I like having lettuce or some of these hardy greens, like kales and stuff like that, that are a decent size early in the season, because as I've pulled out these troublesome weeds, I'll put a plant in its place because it's much bigger, right? It's a bigger size than what something growing from a little bit of root is, because it's got to come up out of the soil. It's got to reach the soil surface. And then that's when things really, take off like a rocket for the weed to grow. Now, by planting something in that space, you're going to be shading out that soil, and hopefully you're going to reduce the regermination of the weeds because you're shading out the light. You can also cover things with a thick layer of cardboard, right? And then a thick mulch on top. And certainly when I was doing garden beds at my last house, I would put a good 2 or 3 layers of cardboard. So like, that's folded cardboard boxes, right? So you got a box, you flatten it out, that's 1 layer. So I would put a good 2 or 3 of those down, really making sure to overlap them. And then I was putting at least 6 inches of wood chips on top to really kind of help block things out. And even then, we'd still find a way, right? They're always going to find a way. But if you can catch them early enough, and you get them before they flower and before they produce seeds, it will get a little bit easier each year. So I don't mind weeding so much. I kind of like that you see the progress as you're going through. Something that was once covered in weeds is now like, oh yeah, okay, I can see what I'm doing here now. This looks a lot better. Taking a photo often helps to kind of take a look back, and certainly on the Facebook group I did that, and I had a picture of when we bought the property versus after, taking down some of the weeds. And we didn't have like fancy equipment when we started doing that. We had a push mower so we like hacked up a bunch of, long grass and stuff with a push mower on, easily over an acre, which was crazy. But then all of the tall weeds that we had to take down with a hedge trimmer, because apparently that was one of the things that made it into, the truck or into the car packed items, was a hedge trimmer and the lawnmower. So I don't know why they did, but they did, and I'm glad that they were, because we were able to kind of, take down a lot of those weeds and stuff that were there. But again, it's, doing things, a little at a time. Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And, little by little, you will eventually get there. Now, if you have used green manures, because those are a great trick to get your soil covered early, because green manures will sprout up in early spring, particularly those plants that are sown over winter, things like rye. They tend to grow up very early in the spring. And if you've listened to the podcast episode about green manures and using cover crops, the trick is you have to kill them off to be able to use the nutrients that are being captured, right? And to do that, you're either going to be cutting them or you're going to be turning them under. So digging them into the soil so that they're going to decompose into that garden bed. And you need that to happen so it's going to be ready for your new veggie plants. So, you want to be making sure that you're doing that early enough so when it comes to, the frost has passed, like all that risk is gone, you've got all of these veggies and you need to get them out, your garden bed is then ready to go. You're not then having to wait a couple of extra weeks with your plants in containers, even longer, to then, be able to get those planted out. So if you are using green manures, check out your calendar. When's your last frost day, and are you going to have enough time to turn them under and get them decomposing? You typically want about 2 weeks before your expected planting date to be able to have them break down and be ready for your plants to go into that garden bed. Now, if your soil is workable, i.e. is not frozen solid, then you can be sowing peas and carrots, and you can be sowing them directly in the soil, because those tend to tolerate the cold pretty well. Carrots especially need to be kept moist and can take up to 3 weeks to germinate. I don't know about you, but I often forget where I sown things in the garden if I don't take my garden journal out with me, which is now covered in compost and soil. But if I don't write down there and then what I did in the garden, I'll forget. But you can sow some radishes in the same area to help you remember where you sowed carrots and make a note in your garden journal. But having good notes and sticking to a planting schedule is one of those things that I've learned as a gardener helps me keep on track and helps me remember this is where I'm planting X, Y, and Z. So having a garden plan and having that list of, these are the things that are going to need to be sown directly outside. So I have a tote of all of the veggies that are good to go, and I kind of organize them based on timing. So I've got things that are able to go out 4 weeks before the last frost, then 2 weeks, and then 1 week, and then at the time of the last frost, and then everything kind of after. So I'm able to kind of help myself keep on track and remember that, okay, I've already done these, and put those back into the normal seed saving area where I keep my seeds in storage, and then I'm able just to keep successionally sowing all of the other crops as we go through the season. Now, when it comes to peas, they need some trellis to grow against, and twiggy sticks are a pretty traditional way to grow your peas. So if you're pruning anything out now, I've got all sorts of things that I'm having to prune and tidy up. There's some old lilac bushes. There's some pruning that we've got to do on some of the fruit trees, because there's bits and pieces that are clearly rubbing against each other, and it's, an entry point for disease. So anything that is particularly twiggy, and by that I mean little bits of branches that have got lots of little bits kind of sticking out, right? They're got lots of little twigs on them. That's why we call them twiggy. But they're great for little pea tendrils to grasp and climb up. And, you know, some people use hazel. Other people use whatever brush they have been, you know, trimming back. And it's kind of a cool way to, you know, reuse what you already have coming out of the garden. But basically all you do is you push these twiggy sticks into the ground and then you plant your peas along the sticks. And these twiggy sticks are going to help your plants grow. They're going to be giving them support to get them up off the ground. And it also gives you a little bit of time to either find or make taller trellis or netting for your peas if that's what you want to do. But if you happen to have like twiggy sticks that are, you know, about 1 foot, 2 foot, maybe 3 feet tall, peas don't tend to get overly tall unless you're growing kind of the drying peas or the shelling pea varieties, which do tend to get pretty tall. Though I had some snow peas once that grew probably about 4 feet, and I can't remember the variety of them. But if in doubt, you know, you can always do a little bit of research to see how tall that they get. Often a lot of seed packets include that information in there on how tall your plant is going to get. So, you know, you can have a look and see if you've got some, you know, twiggy sticks that are going to be big enough, or if you've got kind of smaller ones that you can have at the bottom and then put in some slightly taller, you know, less twiggy, more branchy kind of brush to put in ahead of those twiggy sticks, so the taller ones. So as your plant becomes more established, it's able to grasp onto those instead. If you don't have any twiggy sticks or larger kind of branching pieces that you've pruned, then you could always try driving in a couple of stakes at the end of the row, either end of the row that you've planted your peas in, and then tie some twine every couple of inches, and then that's going to give your pea plants something to grasp off and grow up and along. So that's another way that you can do it too. I've also seen people use chicken wire and various like netting, like kind of stretched across a couple of bamboo canes. There's all sorts of things that you can do and repurpose to have your peas growing up. One of the other things that would be good for you to do this month on your homestead is to make plant labels. Now, I already mentioned sometimes like I forget where I've planted things, especially if I don't have my garden journal with me out when I'm gardening. So making plant labels is kind of fun, and I've seen ones that can be made from, you know, just kind of bigger branches, right, that people have sort of shaved off part of the bark and written on it what the plant is. I've seen ones where people have used smaller sticks and tied on old mason jar lids, right, to mark out areas or plants. And making garden, you know, markers or plant markers is a really great way to teach kids and adults even what plants are, especially if they're new to gardening, right? I've got family members who don't know the difference between a cabbage and a kale, or the carrots from the fennel, for example, or beets from the chard. I like to make, you know, wooden plant stakes, and I like to burn the variety on them. I do a lot of plant trials, so I'm more interested in the varieties and keeping track of how those are performing versus this is a row of peas or that's a row of carrots, for example. But I still like to mark the general plant type on a row so my family knows what they're looking for. If I send them out to go bring in Swiss chard and spinach for dinner, like I want to make sure that they're bringing in Swiss chard and spinach and not tomato leaves, for example. You know, so there's lots of different ways that you can mark your plants, and I would love to see some examples of how you like to mark your plants in your garden over on the Facebook group. So if you have some fun ways to mark your plants or your varieties, then, you know, snap a picture and share it on the Facebook group. I would love to see what you've got going on, and I know other gardeners would love to see them too. Whilst out and about, certainly over the last couple of weeks, and probably also into May as well, I'm seeing like a number of local farms giving away manure. So if you're wanting some for your compost and garden, you know, get out into the local countryside and see what's available. You can also use tools tools like asking on local community groups on Facebook, for example, about local sources of wood chips or compost or manure or whatever. And also check out the local classifieds too. If there's like a local marketplace and stuff, online, then those are some good opportunities to see what's available and get things kind of cheap for your homestead and garden. Now, also around the homestead, it's a really good time to check on fencing and animal housing, do repairs before planting season gets underway, right? Sometimes over winter, weird and wonderful things happen, leaks happen, damage happens with snow, things happen, right? But getting them tackled earlier in the season is going to be a lot better than you trying to do it as, all the other things start to happen on the homestead. Right, once things start to be ready and getting harvested out of the garden, things start to get pretty busy. Right now, of course, it's also the beginning of yard sales, and there's often some really great items that you can pick up and repurpose, like into animal housing, for example. I saw an old dresser that somebody had turned into a rabbit hutch, which was really, really cool. We've got metal roofing on an old barn that's being demolished, right? And that might get turned into a pig pen, or I might turn it into a compost bin or something, or it might become roofing on a chicken tractor. I'm not entirely sure yet, but also you might see things like windows and doors being sold at a yard sale for a crazy price on them. But if you come across things like old windows and doors, you can convert them into a greenhouse or a cold frame to help harden off your seedlings before they get planted outside. Because remember, you need to acclimate your seedlings from life indoors to life outdoors in your garden, right? That helps reduce transplant shock, and it helps them do a lot better when they get put out into your garden. Also, if you happen across any old CDs whilst doing spring cleaning or out at a thrift store or a yard sale, old CDs hung on string and dangled around the vegetable garden can help deter deer and birds. Although, as I found out at the Seedling exchange the other day, that also using pinwheels, or those kind of windmills that you would get at the seaside if you're over in the UK, those can also help deter deer and birds if you pop them sporadically in the garden and around the garden. And of course, you could always try making a scarecrow. I know in the UK there's lots of villages with annual scarecrow festivals that go on in the summer. I think any scarecrow I would make would look like it belonged in a horror movie. But I can see there's a lot of advantage in using them rather than using some of the other methods of, pest control to kind of keep things out of the garden. So I would love to hear from you. What are you doing in your garden or on the homestead? Let me know over in the Facebook group. And until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all next week.